left Tacoma.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm Nora O'Donnell with Gail King and Anthony Mason in New York. We are following a major train derailment in Washington state involving an Amtrak train. These are the first images from the scene south of Seattle in Pierce County.
As you see, the images are very frightening. Emergency crews are responding to this as a mass casualty incident. Train cars, as you see, they are dangling off of a bridge over Interstate 5. They fell down into the southbound lanes of the freeway this morning.
And that freeway is backed up for miles now already as it's closed in the southbound lane. Our CBS affiliate in Seattle, Cairo, reports the Amtrak train number 501 was part of a new high-speed service that just launched today. The train left Seattle at 6 a.m. Pacific. It was scheduled to leave Tacoma at 6:45 a.m. West Coast time, and the derailment happened about 45 minutes later. CBS News travel editor Peter Greenberg is on the phone with us now. Peter, this wasn't just a new train, this was a new station in Tacoma as well. Is that not the case?
It is, and you saw by that picture, those are new cars. The real question is, are they new tracks? And who is maintaining the tracks? Most people don't realize is Amtrak doesn't own the tracks. It's owned by the freight lines. So you have two issues here that the National Transportation Safety Board will be investigating almost immediately. One, the condition of the tracks, and two, was this train equipped with what's called positive speed control, something that will limit how fast the train can go based on the condition of the tracks. You may remember the derailment in 2015 near Philadelphia. Had that been on that train then, it's arguable that never would have happened. Congress gave Amtrak a deadline of 2015 to install it, and that's been extended. So it's safe to say that it's not on every Amtrak train. We don't know whether it was on this train or not.
How fast do these high-speed Amtrak trains usually go?
Well, that's interesting. The Acela, which of course is on the East Coast, gets up to about 86 miles an hour for about 30 miles. And the reason why it doesn't go any faster than that or any longer than that is because of the condition of the tracks. I would suspect that this train could go a little bit faster if the tracks could support it. Certainly the cars could support it because they're new technology cars.
I know this story is still in flux, Peter, as we know, but they'd had the big ribbon-cutting ceremony on Friday, as Anthony just mentioned. This was the first day of the service. You would imagine that they would have had some trial runs before they actually put the train on the tracks with passengers on board.
Well, there it is. They would have had trial runs, but was the train fully loaded? What was the weight of the train, and how much pressure was there on the tracks? All that has to be determined by the NTSB accident team that's probably en route there right now.
You can see the number of emergency vehicles on the scene because this is being treated as a potential mass casualty event as that train has essentially fallen off the bridge and into Interstate 5, which of course goes all the way along the West Coast from all the way the U.S.-Mexico border all the way up through Washington state, and now all southbound lanes are blocked on Interstate 5 as they try and first respond to potential injuries on board that train, and then of course the investigation, which will likely take months to figure out just what went wrong.
All right, Nora, we just have a passenger who was on the train at the time of the accident. His name is Chris Carnes. He joins us, he or she joins us by phone. Chris, can you tell us exactly what happened, what you saw?
Yes, so we had left the Tacoma station about 20 minutes prior, and we had just passed the city of DuPont, which is between Tacoma and Olympia. And at a certain point, it seemed like we were crossing we were reaching sort of a bend in the tracks, and all of a sudden we were slammed into the seats in front of us. And then the car careened down an embankment, and came to a stop. After that happened, we could hear and feel the cars crumpling and breaking apart, and water came out from the ceiling, and there was a lot of dust all over the place, and we had, in order to get out of the car, we had to kick out the window, the emergency window, because the emergency doors were not functioning. There were multiple people injured. There's military police, the firefighters, medical aid of all sorts that are on the scene right now.
Yeah, Chris, we can tell looking at the picture. It's very upsetting just looking at the picture. I can't imagine what it was like for you on the train. Did you all have any warning at all that you were in danger, and how fast was the train going, do you think?
So there was a little bit of creaking initially, but there wasn't a whole lot of warning. From what I can tell, I didn't have a speedometer or anything, but the new section of track the train is supposed to be operating at about 79 miles per hour. I don't know how fast we were going then.
Chris, where were you on the train? Were you near the front?
Yeah, so we were near the front of probably the second or third car.
Because
I think we had actually moved back. Had actually moved back a couple of cars just 2 minutes before.
So when you were able to crawl out through the window of the train, were you on an embankment still, or were you, because some parts of the train
Yes.
in the pictures we're looking at actually ended up on the highway?
Yes. So we were on the portion of the train that went down the embankment, but then there are several other cars that seem to have piled up and been torn apart on top of the rail overpass. And then there's at least one car that seems to be hanging off of the overpass at the moment.
Chris, what types of injuries did you see?
Cuts, people bleeding. I did see one person who was laying on the ground and was not moving.
Was the train full? Was it crowded?
I don't know. Our car was the passenger load was relatively light.
We can't tell by looking at the train. We can't tell by looking at it. But
no,
can you give us an idea how long, how many cars there were in the train?
Let's see here. I would say maybe 10 cars roughly.
Yeah.
And the only car that is still on the tracks is the rear locomotive.
I can tell you, according to Washington State's Department of Transportation, this typical Amtrak Cascade train can seat up to 250 passengers and typically consists of 13 train cars. So we're talking, hundreds of people could be on board that train. Now, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm all right. Thankfully, I mean the seat in front of me just cushioned the blow.
Chris, was everyone else in the car that you were in able to get out?
Yes.
We lost Chris?
Yeah.
I think we've lost.
Yeah.
Yeah, we want to bring Peter Greenberg back in. And Peter, I don't know how much of what Chris said you were able to hear, but what, if anything, additional can you make of what he told us?
Well, it's pure speculation at this point, but he did mention the train was nearing a bend, making a curve. The question was, what speed was it going at that point? Because that's really where the exact derailment happened in Philadelphia, around a curve where there wasn't positive speed control. But again, I have to emphasize this is just pure speculation, but I can almost guarantee you that two things that the NTSB will be focusing on, I should say three, that the NTSB will be focusing on is the medical condition of the engineer on the train. You can imagine there'll be a drug test immediately. Number two, the condition of the track, who owned the track and how well it was maintained. And number three, was there positive speed control installed on this particular train?
Yeah, Chris Carnes also mentioned something about hearing a creaking sound, but he couldn't really tell us exactly what that meant. Does that mean anything to you?
And I can't either. I mean, trains do creak. I mean, if you've been on Amtrak, they creak.
Yeah,
right.
That's certainly true.
Yeah. How often, Peter, would you say they inspect the tracks?
Well, the real question is who's doing the inspection. If the tracks are controlled by the freight trains or the freight lines and they're owned by them, they're really inspecting them for other, like heavy weight and whether or not they're fastened completely in terms of being able to take those stresses and loads. But they're not only checking them for speed because the freight trains don't care about speed. Speed is an issue that has hampered Amtrak since day one because we truly don't have high-speed rail in America for that very reason, the condition of the tracks. And that's an issue that's been around since Amtrak started more than 40 years ago. So it's something we're going to have to look at. But right now, I guarantee you, they're going to be looking at those tracks because Were they new tracks? They were certainly new cars, but were they new tracks, and when was the last time they were inspected?
Those are all really important questions. Just to recap, everyone, if you're just joining us now, an Amtrak train has derailed on a bridge over a highway in Pierce County, Washington. That is just about south of Tacoma. As you can see, there is a major emergency response from local authorities already on the scene there. I'm looking at the Pierce County Sheriff's Twitter feed right now, and they say that injuries and casualties are reported, numbers to come. We've spoken to a witness on the ground who said he saw cuts and bruises, and they had to kick open the emergency window in order to get out of the train because the doors on his car were blocked. This is a new route, a high-speed route. Peter
With the
Greenberg,
first day of service.
The first day of service, where it could have been going around 80 miles an hour if they were on the area where they're going its fastest. This is typically, according to Washington State's Department of Transportation, this type of Amtrak train would have 13 cars in it and could have up to 250 passengers. And if you know Interstate 5, as most people on the West Coast do, because it takes you all the way from Mexico up through Washington State, this area right in Washington State now, it is blocked. All southbound lanes blocked because there's a train essentially hanging in the middle of that interstate.
Yeah, and as we heard Chris Carnes, who was a passenger on that train, tell us a short time ago, he felt a slight rumbling sound in the train. It went off the tracks, and his car careened down an embankment. He said he felt the cars crumbling and actually breaking apart. As you can see, the front car of the train is actually dangling off the track onto the highway. According to that passenger, Chris Carnes, the only actual train still on the track is the locomotive at the very end of it.
You know, I keep thinking, I take the Amtrak regularly, as I know you guys do. There's no seatbelts on a train.
Correct.
And so when you're involved in a collision or an accident like this, you can easily go flying in that car.
No, there's nothing to support you.
Yeah, Chris Carnes told us that he was protected actually by the cushion of the seat in front of him, and he was fortunate to be able to get out of the train through by kicking out the emergency window. The NTSB is on the scene investigating this. We understand. We want to bring in former NTSB Chairman Mark Rosenker to give us some sense of what should be happening right now. Mark, if you can hear me.
Anthony, the NTSB will be dispatching a GO team out to that area to begin the process of looking at this accident, understanding what happened, and ultimately finding out what the preliminary cause was, and ultimately then making recommendations to prevent this kind of accident from happening again.
Mark, what are the most important things they will look at out here?
They'll be looking at a number of factors. They'll be sending investigators that are experts in track, experts in signals, experts in locomotion. Also, they'll be looking at survival factors. All of these investigators will be out there to document the scene and to be understanding exactly what happened.
Does it say anything to you at all, Mark, that this happened? This is their inaugural run, the very first day. It happens 45 minutes into the ride. Does that mean anything at all to you?
Well, that's certainly going to be a factor that they're going to be looking at. But this will be a meticulous, methodical examination of everything, all of the elements which, in fact, could create an environment for a terrible accident like what we're seeing.
Mark, Peter Greenberg was talking to us about one of the Amtrak's significant problems is that while it's running high-speed trains, it doesn't, in fact, own the track lines. The freight trains do, and that they're not actually often built for these kinds of speeds.
That's absolutely correct, Anthony. Amtrak only owns a relatively small portion of the 62,000 miles of track in the United States. So they'll be looking and they'll be working with the railroad that actually owns that track, and they will become a party to this investigation.
You can actually look online to gauge an Amtrak train, and according to Amtrak's real-time location of train 501, which is what this was, it reached 78.5 miles per hour traveling between Seattle and Tukwila, and then after stopping in Tacoma, it sped up to 81 miles per hour before derailment. So, Mark, this train was going fast.
Absolutely. It may well have been doing its maximum speed. The locomotive will actually have what they call an event recorder, very similar to a black box in an aircraft. They will be able to get a lot of data from that particular box when it's finally downloaded.
Mark, what kind of crew is typically on a train like this?
Well, there'll be one engineer, and then there will be a group of conductors and trainmen that will be on board. The conductor, of course, is really technically the person who runs the train.
Are there typically anyone who can respond to an emergency on board a train?
All of the crew that, in fact, are in the cabins themselves, in the rail cars, are all highly trained people and are able to work very, very closely to making sure that they have the emergency capabilities on board the train and work very closely with those that are emergency responders once they finally get to the site.
Mark, we were talking here that there typically aren't seat belts on trains or requirements for them. I mean, is that something that's been discussed?
Well, we've looked at it, but at this point, we've never come about to make a full decision on whether it's necessary or not. Clearly, the survival factors folks that are going to be part of this investigation will be making recommendations to that end.
As you said, they will go to the scene, they will look at the track. When it comes to the conductor, what will investigators want to hear from him or her?
They'll be asking the conductors all kinds of questions. Did they hear any sounds? How did the cars react? Remember that we don't know if this was a push-pull train, meaning that the locomotive was, in fact, actually pushed the train forward, or if that last car was the tail.
Will they look at cell phone records?
They'll certainly be looking at the engineer and the crew, but they'll also be doing a toxicology test as it relates to any type of drugs or alcohol involvement.
We know that this derailment happened just at about 7:30 a.m. Pacific time, so probably the early end of the commute out there. This was Amtrak train number 501, which operates between Seattle and Portland. We've just gotten in some video from someone who saw part of this train derailment. Let's take a look. And there you can see someone driving by and probably pulled out a camera there to look at that one, which is a lot of backed up traffic because all of the southbound traffic there has been blocked, but also the emergency response. But you can see there a picture of really just how one of those train cars, if not several of them, just went careening off of that bridge or overpass onto Interstate 5. This is actually, for other people who may know Joint Base Lewis McChord, this is right around that area too. A military installation is also in that area. You
can see the massive backup there, which when we first went on the air now 10 or 15 minutes ago was already 3 miles long, and now on southbound on Interstate 5, a major artery up and down the west coast, and now it must be significantly longer than that. You can also see that front car that is literally hanging off the overpass down onto the interstate. We had Chris Carnes, who was a passenger on one of the cars that was probably, he said, 3 or 4 back from the front. He ended up going down an embankment and having to kick through an emergency window to get out of the car. He said his car was not, it was not heavily populated and everybody was able to get out, but he said only the last car on the train was still on the tracks.
You know, I keep thinking about, too, I mean, if these passenger cars essentially ended up, part of them in the interstate, they may have also hit some cars.
Very possible.
Yeah.
Looking at that picture, it looks
that
like
we're just driving by through on what is a busy interstate early in the morning as people are sort of making their way to school and making their way to work.
Right in the beginning of the commute, Nora, it's 7:30 Pacific time. Looking at the picture, it's definitely on the ground, and you don't know what's underneath the train.
And again, this is a train that started in Seattle at 6 a.m. West Coast time, made its way to Tacoma, and was coming out of the Tacoma station, which was brand new, just been dedicated over the weekend and open for passengers today. And about 45 minutes after leaving Tacoma is when this accident occurred.
What we know, according to Amtrak's real-time location, which you can view online, this train was probably going about 80 miles an hour. There are typically in this Amtrak Cascades train, which is what this route is, they usually can carry up to about 250 passengers. There's 13 cars in there, so that's a significant amount of people that's traveling.
Yeah, it could be a significant amount of people. And again, as you pointed out, Nora, it's very possible this front train, which is still dangling onto Interstate 5, could have hit cars or trucks down there on the road. We don't know. And as you can see, again, an enormous backup on Interstate 5 where there is no southbound traffic.
Well, we heard Chris Carnes say that he witnessed injuries himself, that he saw injuries on the scene. He saw cuts and some bruises. I'm hoping that the pictures at the casualties will not be as bad as these pictures could indicate. Right now, we still don't know. The story's unfolding right now as we're on the air.
I want to bring in transportation correspondent Chris Van Cleve, who has followed disasters like this. And Chris, significant to see now this Amtrak train derailed on this overpass in Washington State.
Yeah, Nora, it is, this is their Cascade service. It's train 501 that typically goes between Seattle and Portland. Where the train derailed is along Interstate 5, south of Seattle. Tacoma is sort of the next largest city as you go down, and what you're seeing there is it looks like maybe the second or third car in behind the engine has gone off the freeway, gone off this bridge onto the freeway there. The lead car after the engine also sort of dangling over there, and perhaps another car that's derailed from another angle. So this is a fairly serious derailment. If you think back a couple of years ago to Amtrak 188, where you saw a pretty bad accident there. Just a couple of weeks ago, we got a NTSB report on a fatal accident involving Amtrak that was critical of the railroad safety culture. In fact, it found 29 active failures and latent conditions that indicated, I'm quoting here from the NTSB, a systemic problem with Amtrak's safety culture, and found that Amtrak safety programs were deficient. Obviously, we don't know the cause here. We don't know what would have happened, but certainly these look to be fairly standard Amtrak regional cars. I can't say for sure that they're the same kind that were involved in that were similar to the Amtrak 188 crash, but these cars tend to be older cars, and depending upon this particular line is not as densely traveled as, say, the Northeast Corridor. But certainly you're going to have people on these trains, and this looks like a fairly violent derailment based on the pictures we're able to see so far.
Chris, just looking online at the Washington State Department of Transportation, this was a new Amtrak Cascades train. I mean, they were billing it as something that could cut travel time between Seattle and Portland by 10 minutes. And I'm just reading through this. They were able to reduce some of the time because they rerouted some of the trains between Tacoma and Olympia with the upgrading of tracks and signal systems. This was a new route that was taking trains on an inland corridor. What might that mean?
Well, so, they're going to go and look at the tracks. What may have led this train to derail? Certainly, they're going to look at the speed. Whenever there's an accident like this, we're going to find out that there were multiple factors that ended up playing in here. They're going to check the engineer and see, just like think back to Amtrak 188. There are all those questions about the engineer's performance. Was he distracted? Was there a substance issue? We don't know any of that, of course, but they're going to look at that. They're going to look at the condition of the tracks. They're going to look at the speed of the train. Was the train going too fast? Had something happened on those tracks earlier? Was there an anomaly that wasn't detected? All of those things are going to be a question. Certainly when it's a new route, one of the things you want to know is, was the engineer familiar enough with that route? There was a lot of speculation in Amtrak 188, for example. That engineer had only been doing that stretch for a few weeks. And, one of the theories was that he just got confused about where he was on the tracks and the train was going too fast. So that certainly will be something they look at. And just, you're going to go through sort of a checklist of anything that could go wrong and start trying to narrow those out. But when you talk about are these new cars, you're then going to want to see if there is some bigger issue with those cars, or if this is just something that happened because there was a problem with the track. I mean, there's all kinds of scenarios, and I think you had Mark Rosenfeld talk about some of those a few minutes ago that end up getting looked at here. But it's
Chris, we've just gotten a new picture. We've just gotten a new picture from the scene, and guys, it really looks like there is a train underneath. There's a train on the road, actually on the highway, and another train on top of that.
So
one stacked on top of the other. And after Amtrak accident 188, there was a lot of talk about that stop-gap system on the tracks. Chris, can you talk about that?
Sure. So positive train control. That is something that, in theory, would have prevented something like Amtrak 188 because if the train had been going too fast or if it had detected a problem in the track, it would have stopped the train. Amtrak has got that running on most of the Northeast corridor. That's between, say, Washington, D.C. and Boston. But Amtrak doesn't own many of the train tracks that it operates on, including up in Washington State. So that's up to the freight rails to install positive train control, and they are behind schedule. The federal government has kicked the mandate for that back. It should have already passed. It was delayed again. So positive train control likely was not in place here. And one of the things that we saw with Amtrak 188 was just the force that these trains experience when they abruptly stop. And that, remember, one of those train cars in Amtrak 188 essentially got, plowed through by another train car. So the force of these crashes can be really great if that train was going at a high rate of speed, which is certainly possible through that stretch of track.
And we should tell everyone too that we do not have any reports of casualties from officials there. However, we have spoken with a witness who says that he saw many cuts and bruises, including someone who was laying there not moving. I just want to go back to this picture that we showed you a short time ago. It was actually tweeted out by a Washington State trooper, and the trooper's name is Brooke Bova. And what you can see if you look very closely is it looks like not only is one of the tracks on the ground, the other one appears to have crushed into it. And if you look at that condition of that car, it looks like it has suffered some serious damage.
It's upside down. It's actually, it's flipped over, and the other train the next car has landed on top of it. And the first car looks like it might have even burned.
Like it's been burned.
Yeah, and if you look to the left of that car, that orange, that almost looks like a tractor trailer. So, we were talking about whether those trains could actually come off and hit some of the traffic below. That looks like a tractor trailer, that orange truck to the left.
Yes.
That is some significant damage.
It could be.
I mean, I'm thinking, how do you, if your train flips over onto an interstate and you don't have a seatbelt on, this is some scary stuff.
Very scary.
When you look at how badly damaged that.
Yeah,
yes, we were talking about
that, Chris.
And we just received word from a State Department spokesman that there were 75 people on board the train when it derailed. We heard earlier that this particular train line can carry up to 250 passengers, but a State Department spokesman says that there were 75 people on board. Again, the train had just
Department of Transportation.
Yeah, State Department of Transportation.
Right.
Confirms that there were 75 people on board, and we should say the train had just left.
Sorry, Chris,
go ahead. Chris.
Sorry. I was going to say, we can also tell you the NTSB is monitoring this. I fully expect you'll see the NTSB launch a team to look into this accident as they get a little bit more information here, but expect to see an NTSB investigation here. And
as well as the disruption to rail travel here, and as we mentioned, this was part of a major new route between Seattle down to Portland. The Washington State Department of Transportation is telling us that southbound I-5 will be closed for an extended period. This is another major travel artery through the Northeast, and as you can see, because as we've mentioned, there is at least one car on the highway flipped over with another car that has fallen and basically was stopped by the train down on the highway. So that's a situation that is going to take a very long time to clear up. We have no sense whatsoever of what casualties there may be in those cars you see dangling off of the overpass there. We did speak, as we've mentioned, with one passenger who was in a car a little further back named Chris Carnes a while ago, who described his car careening down an embankment, feeling the car basically crumble and breaking apart and escaping through a window that he kicked out. He said there were not many other passengers in his car. They all got out, but he saw multiple injuries.
And we have views now, Anthony, from a Google map, a satellite view of this accident from a Google map of the track that you can see there. Yeah, you can clearly see a curve there.
Yeah, that's what the passenger, Chris Carnes, described the train going into a curve, and that's where the accident occurred.
You know, I can remember that Philadelphia Amtrak crash that I covered, and that was the issue. It was going too fast around a curve.
Yeah.
And because of the unfamiliarity with that curve and because the conductor did not know how to slow down, that caused the derailment. I mean, they figured that out after, you know, several years of investigation, that it was speed and it was the curve.
And again, we should say this accident is very much in flux. We don't know the conditions of the track. We don't know the condition of the conductor or the engineer. All we're going by right now is what we're being told from witnesses on the scene. And when you can look at the visual yourself, just the shot, guys, of that train on top of the other train that's flipped over and clearly looks like it's burned. And Nora, when you pointed out the tractor trailer to the left of the screen, this happened during rush hour.
Yeah.
First responders still on the scene.
And again, as the passenger we spoke with told us, from what he saw when he was able to get out of the train, every car except the locomotive at the end was off the tracks. And as you can see, there's at least one down on the road with a second dangling just above it. And then he was on an embankment, so he didn't end up on the road. But it looks like, obviously, the people in the very front, that there are going to be some significant casualties there.
And we've been told that this train line typically has 13 cars. So it's a big line.
We've just heard from the Pierce County Sheriff's spokesman, Ed Troyer, that there are fatalities. So, you know, we knew that this was likely a mass casualty event, and we can see from the pictures, but we're now hearing official word that there are casualties and potential fatalities, indeed. So you can only imagine, too, what family and friends who knew that their loved ones who take this route are thinking and trying to get information about their loved ones who are on this
train and or traveling on the highway. Chris Van Cleve, can you tell us more about the pictures that we're looking at now?
Well, you know, when you see some of these pictures, you understand why you're starting to hear reports of fatalities and some serious injuries. You know, the train cars, as you said, this was a fairly new route. And those are fairly new train cars. They have been engineered to be crash resistant, but certainly you're going to have a heavy impact there. And one of the things now at the NTSB, which will almost certainly launch an investigation here, we'll look at is the survivability. What could be learned here? You know, trains don't have seatbelts, so that was something that came up a lot in the Amtrak 188 investigation. Is when the train started to be derailed, people were thrown around the interior of the train. Which can result in a lot of those injuries we've been talking about.
Chris, you mentioned an NTSB report that came out about 2 weeks ago, which was critical of Amtrak's safety culture. What specifically was it critical of?
Sure. So in that report, think back after Amtrak 188, there was that incident a few months later, also in Pennsylvania, where a train hit 2 workers on the tracks.
Yeah.
While going through that that accident, the NTSB found that there were communication issues, safety planning issues that led the board to believe that there was not a good enough focus on the safety culture inside Amtrak. You know, the NTSB has also been critical of the lack of positive train control, the fact that this is not on every set of tracks in the United States. They have expressed disappointment that the Department of Transportation has kicked the timeline back repeatedly on positive train control. We don't know yet if positive train control would have made a difference in this crash, but that is technology that is designed to stop a speeding train, that is designed, if there is something wrong with the track, to slow or stop the train.
I'm just looking at our affiliate out there in Seattle, Cairo, who says confirmed 70 people were on board when this train derailed. So if in fact it was a full capacity train, they could fit up to 250, but according to our affiliate, there were 70 people on board the train when it derailed at about 7:30 a.m. Pacific time. Yeah.
It's, I mean, obviously, we don't know how many people were on each car, but and we're not exactly sure how many cars were on this train, but typically, you know, the passenger we spoke to said he thought there were about 10. Typically, it can be 12 or 13. So it would sound like each car was not particularly highly populated. and hopefully there were not too many people in those front cars, as we've shown you. There you see one car upside down on Interstate 5, having fallen off the overpass. There is the second car, which has landed essentially in the bottom of that car, and then subsequently all the cars behind it, with the exception of the very last, which is the locomotive, also derailed, according to that passenger we spoke with.
Nora, Cairo says 70. The State Department of Transportation says 75. And as you point out, the train can carry 250, and it squares with what Chris Carnes, the witness, told us, that there were very few people on his car. But again, this train, this was the beginning launch, and it was very early in the train route. So I guess if there is good news here, it's that the train was not fully loaded. Yes, Chris?
A little bit of information from the Pierce County Sheriff, who we understand are so far sort of leading the police response here. They're reporting that several cars on I-5 were struck by the derailed Amtrak train cars. Multiple motorists injured on the roadway. They say no fatalities reported amongst the motorists yet. But so there's another element here. It was rush hour time in Seattle when this happened. So as those cars came flying off the tracks, they came down and impacted cars on Interstate 5. I-5 is a very busy freeway through Seattle. In fact, far more people in the Seattle area are going to be driving than they are going to be riding Amtrak. So the Pierce County Sheriff is now reporting that several cars on the interstate were struck as the train cars came off the tracks. So many of your injuries are going to come from people in those vehicles, in addition to the 70 to 75 people on board the Amtrak train. And that difference in numbers, that's not unusual. It took Amtrak about a day or so to get a firm count of how many people were on train 188, because it's a porous system. People get on, people get off. So you know how many tickets have been sold. But if somebody decided to get off at a stop earlier or had missed their stop, your numbers can change. So that 70 to 75 could fluctuate a bit. Plus, you're going to have train crew. You're also going to have the engineer and conductors, so that could be the difference as well.
And Chris, again, to Chris's point about far more people traveling on this highway, where we now know that a number of cars were struck by the train when it came off the track. The southbound, the Washington State Department of Transportation is saying will be closed for an extended period of time while this accident is being investigated.
And it is top of the hour, noon Eastern Standard Time, 9 a.m. Pacific Time. Many people waking up at this hour and seeing that there has been a major train derailment in Washington State. What we know is, according to the local sheriff's office, there are confirmed fatalities. There were about 70 people on board this Amtrak Cascades train. It derailed around 7:30 a.m. Pacific Time in the early hours of the morning commute. This was a new route for Amtrak. They had just put it into motion, a new route that was supposed to be a little quicker for people traveling on this train. So there were some new signals, some new things on the tracks in place. And what we've seen from Google Map is that this was a curve that went right over Interstate 5, a curve in the tracks, a normal curve. But we also, according to Amtrak, this train was going about 80 miles an hour. So one of, I think, the top questions for many people is speed, the bend in this curve, as NTSB is already making its way to the scene to figure out what went wrong. But I think it's also fair to say that right now people are focused on recovery, because there were 70 people on board that train. And the pictures that we've seen so far, not only the train that's upside down that's on Interstate 5, but also the other ones that are hanging over. And then, of course, the cars and vehicles that officials now confirm were also struck that were on Interstate 5 as a result of this collision.
You can see that one car there upside down. Looks like it may have burned. Another car landed on top of it, and all the way back, as far back as that train went, the number of cars we have not been able to nail down, but it's probably somewhere in the order of 10 to 12. They all went off the track. Some went down the embankment. And at least one witness has told us that he witnessed multiple injuries. We have heard there are fatalities. And as Nora mentioned, vehicles on the road on the southbound side were struck by this train as it landed on I-5.
That's the last thing you expect when you're driving. I keep thinking about those people, guys, on the highway, going to school, going to work, wherever they were going.
Yeah.
You're driving down the highway. The last thing you expect is a train to come flying in the air, toppling on front of your car. As you said, Nora, they will be focusing on recovery right now, but one of the things they will look at is the engineer and the conductor. The engineer, what was the condition of, they said they will look at toxicology reports, they will look at cell phone records, and they will look at his familiarity and training on driving this particular route. So a lot of questions need to be answered before they can come up with any kind of conclusion.
The NTSB on its way to the scene, and we want to bring back in former NTSB chairman Mark Rosenker, who I think is still with us. Mark, there's a camera on this train, is there not?
That's correct, Anthony. There's actually two now as a result of the Pennsylvania crash that was coming around the corner much too fast, 188. Amtrak decided to not only have cameras that had already been placed on the dashboard, but they've got them now inside so you can actually see what the engineer was doing, which would in fact tell us if he was distracted in any way, had a medical emergency. But they will do a meticulous job of, one, doing the interviews with not only the crew members, but as many passengers as possible. This video, interestingly enough, may show any type of track anomaly as the train was coming over, and it will also, through the actual recorder, the event recorder on board the locomotive, show if, in fact, the engineer attempted to do any type of braking. An emergency braking would be absolutely amazing in that, and it may well have been a contributing factor to the accident if, in fact, were problems with the track.
Why would the braking have been a contributing factor?
Because it could have been moving so fast, and you could actually get a kind of a push-pull effect as the cars begin to come on top of each other.
Yeah, we just want to point out to people who are looking at this now, it's difficult to tell, but it appears there may be people inside the train. Actually, it might have been a reflection of people down on the highway there. You can see the massive response of first responders. The door on the car that's dangling looks open, so hopefully people were able to get out of that car. We do know that the one passenger we spoke to said he had to kick out the emergency window to get out of the car on the embankment, which would have been behind the image you're looking at now. This is a live picture of the scene in DuPont, Washington. Again, this was a train. This was Amtrak train 501, its Cascade service, which travels from Seattle to Portland. It had come out of Tacoma, a brand new station in Tacoma, which literally opened for passengers today. They had the dedication on Friday. It was about 45 minutes out of Tacoma. It was rounding a curve just on the one side of this overpass you're seeing now, when it suddenly went off the tracks, and as you can see, at least one car landed on southbound Interstate 5 upside down. Another car right behind it was stopped by the car in front of it. It is still dangling there, and every subsequent car behind it is off the tracks, with the exception of the locomotive at the very back of the train, which is the only thing that still stayed on the tracks, according to the passenger we spoke with earlier.
Chris Van Cleve is on the phone and has additional information. Chris?
Yeah, so it looks like these tracks belong to a freight rail train. That's one of the reasons why Gail asked about positive train control earlier. Amtrak doesn't own these tracks, so these tracks would be maintained by a freight railroad, and Mark can talk a little bit about why that situation, the sharing. But what you're also starting to see, you're going to see multicolored tents along the scene there. That's part of the triage effort. That's what really right now the focus is going to be on, is making sure everybody is off that train and getting people medical care. So there's going to be an area where there's probably like a red tarp or a red tent. That's going to be your critical injuries. You're then going to have a yellow one, and those are more in your walking wounded, but that could be broken bones, other sorts of somewhat serious injuries. And then you're going to have a green area where people who are not terribly hurt or not hurt at all are going to be checked out. So right now, the focus is going to be search, rescue, and transporting the injured. Once they've gotten everyone accounted for and treated, then you really sort of move into your investigation mode and can start trying to figure out what went wrong. But right now, it's trying to get a handle of how many people were on that train. Was it 70? Was it 75? Because that becomes really important when you're trying to account for everybody. How many vehicles were involved, and can you get to everyone, and can you get them help? And that's where they are now.
And Chris, we are seeing right now a lot of what you're talking about, the green, yellow, and the red tents. We can see a lot of passengers who are walking around with blankets. They appear to be moving on their own, so that certainly is a good sign. And this train, as we know, we've been told, can carry up to 250 people. Conflicting reports about whether it's 70 to 75. So it's certainly on the low number, but it also was very early in the journey of this train. But they've already started the triage process that you were talking about.
And for the next, probably couple of hours, that's going to be the focus. And once they've gotten that head count, that's when we're going to start to get some real solid information. Right now, we're in that stage of breaking news where numbers are going to change a little bit here and there as this goes on. The other thing to think about here is how many vehicles on the roadway were impacted from this as this fell across a very major interstate in the Washington State area.
The Pierce County Sheriff, and Pierce County covers this DuPont, the city of DuPont, confirms that there are injuries and casualties. We've also heard that there are fatalities involved here. So this is a very significant development. You mentioned those two tents, and it looked like that yellow tent, whereas Broken Bones looked quite busy, that we saw earlier. So a lot of activity as they are tending to the injuries of those on board this Amtrak train that derailed early this morning.
Nora, the most critical are going to go to Harborview, which is the level 1 trauma center, as well as a pediatric trauma and burn center for Washington State. You'd have the option to airlift those people if there's an open area nearby. Harborview is a very good medical center, so that's where you would be taking your most injured, your most severely injured, and then it's going to be a matter of starting to figure out what happened here and what do you do about the fact that you have one of your major arteries in Seattle closed. Seattle's an area that's got a big population, and you don't want to complain about traffic at a time like this, but it's a major logistic issue now for the state as to what you do when you've got one of your major freeways north-south closed.
Yeah, as to Chris's point there, the Department of Transportation in Washington is saying that southbound I-5, that major artery will be closed for an indefinite period of time, and you can see right there why with that train car upside down on the tracks. Our coverage will continue throughout the day on your local news on this CBS station and our 24-hour streaming news network, CBSN. Watch it at cbsnews.com.
And we'll be back with special reports as more information becomes available to us. And you can watch complete coverage from the scene tonight on the CBS Evening News with Jeff Glor.
This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Nora O'Donnell with Gail King and Anthony Mason, CBS News, New York.